Welcome to Mapping the Self. I'm Selena Garofino. Know thyself was carved into stone at the entrance of Apollo's temple at Delphi in ancient Greece. Scholars, poets, philosophers have debated the big questions around what it is to know yourself for thousands of years. I invite you to join me for conversations with artists, creators, scholars, spiritual teachers, writers, and humans of all walks of life to discuss these big questions together, to engage in a dialogue around what it is to live fully, to map ourselves, to know ourselves, to grow our compassion and listening, and to explore together our highest possibilities. Welcome. I am so honored to welcome Jeff Krasno. Jeff is someone for whom I have profound respect. In an age where so many are profiting in one way or another from a position of divisiveness, Jeff has been a real voice of clarity and sound reason and humility, at least to me, the past couple of years, and has more than once in these tumultuous times given name to and articulated with a real generosity and grace things that I was thinking and feeling and having some difficulty fleshing out. And so I'm just so honored to have you here and to get to speak with you. Welcome, Jeff.
Nice. Thanks, Selena. I'm glad you're doing this, and it's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Just quickly, in case you don't know who Jeff is, ironically, I had spent so much time at Wanderlust Hollywood and dreaming of going to Wanderlust, and I met you on social media and started reading your writing and was really taken with your writing and had no idea who you were. And I think the first time we spoke on the phone, I told you I wasn't sure if you worked in the medical field because at the time you were writing so much about the pandemic.
Yeah, I feel like I've joined the ranks of moonlighting microbiologists and virologists and vaccinologists for better or worse. And I think in some ways it's, while it's dangerous for non-experts or lay people to speak on some of these issues, I am optimistic by just the reality, or with the reality, that so many people have become interested in physiology and how the body works, and the immune system, and the cardiovascular system, and the pulmonary system. And I include myself among those people. So I really feel like I'm in medical school right now, and try to really understand mechanism and pair mechanism with modality. Because I find that when we understand the mechanisms of how things work, it is easier to reify behaviors into one's life. At least it has been for me. So, yeah, but I never went to med school.
I think what you just said is wonderful. I have a master's degree in public health, and I want information to be open source. And at the same time, what you just spoke to, the issue is when people don't have the training to understand what they're reading, or to understand, for example, the term risk means something very different to an epidemiologist than it does to the average person on the street. But what you are highlighting is that all of us are capable of learning what we're reading and learning how to approach what we're reading, and to build our knowledge base to be able to have good conversations and good understandings for ourselves. And it's very important to public health, for lack of a better word, buy-in, that people do understand what the information that's in front of them. And if anything, you've demonstrated that anyone can do it.
That's true. Anybody can do it. And, it is, you can be paralyzed by the complexity of the jargon. If you were to go onto the NIH website or the NCBI website and start reading clinical trials or primary source data, or if you go and read Nature or Science or other stringent medical journals, it's almost like every other word is a word that you don't understand at the beginning. But I've been in enough situations in my life to become very comfortable with the discomfort of confusion And I've sat in a lot of finance meetings, for example. I never went to business school, but nodding my head and smiling until, I start to understand every other word, and then eventually every word to the best of my ability. And that's really been my approach towards grokking some of these concepts that have reared their heads in the last year and a half or 2 years, but also just more generally about the mechanisms of the body, and not to be overwhelmed by jargon, but just look at it as an opportunity to learn and to engage in broader, rigorous conversations about the nature of reality on the most meta level, but also just on the nature of how the human body functions.
Yes. And it's funny. When I was in graduate school, we joke that you become a terrible writer as you go through graduate school. Like the graduate school makes good writers into bad writers, because the more specialized you get, the more jargon you learn and the more buried in this technical language you become. And it's very unfortunate, I think.
Yeah, well, this makes the case for the sort of heuristics of religion or myth, if you will, that we need to be skillful storytellers in order to create vessels for emotions and for good ideas. And so I really challenge myself on a consistent basis when I'm writing to often anchor complex, philosophical ideas or ideas related to biochemistry or physiology. I try to actually gird them to story, often stories that happen in my own kind of madcap, somewhat dysfunctional family, and ground them there to create a sense of empathy or connection, where someone can at least get their foot in the door of a complicated conversation or topic. There's one that I'm kind of playing with right now, and you can pull on this thread if you want. It's your show. But that during the first 4 months of quarantine, we were fortunate enough to be in this bubble up at our modest little commune up in Topanga, California, which is Neil Young's old property that we've converted into this production facility, retreat center / kooky sustainability tabula rasa. And every night, my daughter, Micah, would come into the kitchen. She's my 12-year-old now. And she would ask if she could ring the bell. And, she was very anxious. She would solicit multiple times. And finally, when, dinner was ready, we'd be like, okay, Micah, you can go ring the bell. And Micah would sort of bounce out of the kitchen and tear down this cobblestone path. And she's a very adept dancer. So she would often intersperse a couple cartwheels along the way. And she'd get to the entrance passage of our property. Kind of hanging in the transom of this stone passage was a bell. And she would grab this thick jute rope that was dangling from the crown of the bell and sort of lift herself up on it. And so all of her weight was on it, and she'd latch her feet onto the kind of bulbous knot at the bottom of the bell. And that would, of course, swing the skirt of the bell back and forth, and the clapper would hit the bell and make this sonorous resonant sound that would signal to all of our commune members that dinner was ready. And slowly everyone would kind of trickle down to the dinner table and break bread together. And it was an absolutely, obviously incredibly fortunate, but just a really beautiful way to spend time over that 4-month period when we were kind of anchoring into lockdown for the first time. And that story, in some ways, illustrates everything we need to know about life and the nature of what it is like to be human. And I have started just to kind of use that. Well, I've never used it before, but I was thinking about it last night as that there is this, there's the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics is that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's only transferred. Mm-hmm. And so I've started to think about life and what it is like to be alive as just energy, and that we are these kind of ephemeral bodies that are animated for a short blink of an eye. We're almost these packets of information that are animated through energy for the length of our lifetimes. And that we are, the nature of what it is like to be alive is simply the transferal of that energy all of the time. And so, Micah, uses the energy created by the mitochondria in her body to run down the cobblestone step to transfer her chemical energy into kinetic energy that rings the bell, which produces a sound, which is really just sound energy, vibrations in the form of waves, defined or described by their amplitude and frequency, which determines their loudness and pitch, that vibrate through the air and then eventually, hit someone's eardrum, where they're subsequently, through a whole process that I won't waste your time with right now, transferred into kind of electromagnetic signals that are then, decoded by the brain. Mm-hmm. And then the neurons in your brain leverage, their motor function, for Skylar or Julia or Jake or whoever was on the commune to finish up their task and start walking down to the dinner table. And that even if you want to pull the thread backwards from there, Micah's energy that gives her the ability to cartwheel down to the bell in the first place is provided by an apple, let's say, that is really simply a combination of genetic information and light energy fossilized or captured by the sun through the process of photosynthesis. So 93 million miles away, there's a process of fusion of two hydrogen nuclei forming a helium atom, and through that process, energy is emitted and travels through the universe and enters our atmosphere as electromagnetic radiation, as visible light, and interacts with chlorophyll or a chloroplast in an apple tree leaf and starts this process. So, of the creation of energy, glucose, and then we eat it, and then we're energized. And we really, when we begin to sort of unpack all of these, what we might call scientific mechanisms, we get to a broader sort of philosophical epiphany, satori, of what it is like to be alive. And this is why it's sometimes helpful to actually understand mechanism, because it can lead us to a new sensation. That's really the best word for it, because it's not an intellectual understanding per se, but the sensation of what it is like to be alive, of consciousness, essentially, as energy animated for this short period of time, which we call our lives, in which we bring forth information in service of connection. And all of the information that we hold as humans, are obviously our DNA, our underlying nucleotide sequence of our DNA, but also sort of the expression of that DNA, that changing epigenetic expression, all of our thoughts, all of our creative works, our musical writings, our papers, our books, all of that information that comprises a life is animated by energy for the purpose of connection. And nature's underlying logos, if you will, its operating system is to take the packet of information that is our life and select for the best of it. And as we move on, as our physical lives deteriorate and decay, nature picks them up. So we, in that sense, as energy, we never really die. What it's like to be subjectively alive, the instruments which we perceive the world, eyes and ears and nose and mouth and taste and all that stuff, those cease to function. But energy is always transferred. And so, sometimes being able to find a story to hold complicated ideas can be very useful.
Story. That was beautiful. And there's several little threads I want to pull on. Story always puts something more up for grabs than mere truth, which can be cruel, and mere candor. Story, to me, I've been writing about this a lot. I'm very interested in mythology. I love reading stories and listening to people tell stories. And it's the larger net that holds us, right? Stories, to quote Dr. Martin Shaw, it's the bone memory. It's the ancestor. It's the stories we don't even know came from the ancestors breathing us forward. And even what you just described, often, especially I find in wellness and spiritual circles, they'll think that science is too mechanistic, that it's stripping down complexity. But that's only if you take the first level of science, because when you go deeper, the things you were just describing, it's not mechanistic and simplistic and eradicating mystery. To me, it cracks open my sense of awe and a bigger view of seeing.
Absolutely. I mean, Taoism for me is science. The yin yang, which is used, throughout Chinese philosophical thoughts or thought or religion, represents the kind of some foundational principles of nature, that everything is simply arising in opposites, kind of what Alan Watts also referred to as the coincidence of opposites. And we can really study that in science. Of course, we can experience it in life as, sleep and wakefulness and being and non-being and left and right and front and back and outside and inside, and the terms that symbolize things that cannot exist without each other. But we can also see within the mechanisms of science or nature how there is an infinite intelligence behind everything that seeks to synthesize coherence out of opposites. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the carbon cycle, which of course we don't have to go into right now, but essentially how photosynthetic cells, create glucose and oxygen, and non-photosynthetic cells, you and me, create water and carbon dioxide out of glucose and oxygen, so that we're existing kind of in coherence out of opposites. Or electricity, for example, which is essentially a dance of repulsion and attraction between positive and negative forces, or the foundational components of an atom, which are, positively charged protons and negatively charged electrons. And of course, then you can go into the human body and find all of these different things to the autonomic nervous system, which has created the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, which are releasing neurotransmitters or associated with neurotransmitters that might be considered opposite, or your liver or your pancreas that's producing insulin, but in low insulin states, it's producing glucagon. So it's like over and over again, when you're actually studying science and mechanism, what you're discovering is that the world emerges as a coincidence of opposites. Mm-hmm. And they're from a more, I suppose, philosophical or Zen place or Taoist place, that there is a foundational and fundamental intelligence of the universe that creates coherence out of these opposites. And just the yin yang is such it's a hackneyed symbol, but that these opposites also exist within each other.
Yes, they're fractals and fractals and fractals. Every water has heat in it. All of these opposites contain one another. And all of great nature is founded on these polarities. And that's the beauty in the Katona yoga method. I don't know if you've ever taken a Katona yoga class. It's all anchored on these Taoist principles of polarity, and that you and I are the mediators, that everything is creating a Vesica Pisces. And our job isn't to be straight, it's to be in the moving middle. And to mediate, the fire that always rises and the water that always descends, and to mediate the 24 hours of the day. Naveen says really beautifully, the sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set, but you rise and you set and the planet spins. And she always says, great nature will squish you like a bug. It's not personally invested in you, but it's not careless. And it has given you eyes to see and ears to hear and a nose to sniff out a situation, to organize yourself in these greater cycles of polarity around us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It makes me think of what you say about the nature of the sun setting and rising, is that just the nature of how things are is always a relationship. It's that, you may be looking at the sun at a particular time or from a particular angle, dependent on your physical location in the world. And that is your subjective experience, your relationship with that particular star. And someone else is having another separate subjective relationship with that star. And then that is kind of underwrites consciousness as a subjective experience. And then, of course, what we try to cultivate is consciousness as a collective experience. Mm-hmm. And that is, for me, has only been revealed through practice, specifically meditation practice.
Meditation practice. Yeah, that's a big one for starting to get the bigger picture. I always loved, there's this word in the Pali language, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing, but it's upekkha, and it's the word where we get equanimity from. And it's broadly this idea of to see with understanding. And one of the things that has gotten me through the last couple of years and my own cycles is this bigger remembrance that alignment with life as it really is where the beauty is. When we align with the deeper truths and stop resisting. And I have this book from, I think it's Swami Chaitanya, that says the only difference between tension and flow is your resistance. And I have to remind myself whenever there's big tension or a big shift happening that, like, what is life trying to show me right now in this moment, in these present conditions? And am I going to move with it and let the wave carry me a bit? Or am I going to keep hammering at the thing that is no longer available to me?
Yeah. Well, of course, in Taoism, there is that notion of Wu Wei, which is actually hard to describe. I mean, it can mean sort of going with the flow, if you will. There's certainly an element of upekkha in there, of equanimity, of evenness and equipoise in the face of gain or loss or honor or dishonor or praise or blame or pleasure or pain, that there is a stability that is maintained regardless of external circumstances. But I think it's also, as you elucidate, a skillful way of navigating the world. And it does require the cultivation of skill to understand which direction the current is flowing. And,
is that then the you way, the effortful effort?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And I mean, with Upekkha and Wu Wei, I think it can sometimes be misunderstood as lack of ambition. But I think that is a misunderstanding. I think that we can bring our highest selves into the world through action,
yes,
but without being attached to the results of those actions. And this yields a very, I suppose, enlightened way of being, because without attachment to the result or the product, all you're concerned with is process. And of course, really that's all there is, because all we have is this everlasting now. All there is process. And when we fully embrace process and not product, well, then we can focus our attention moment to moment to align ourselves with our highest principles. Mm-hmm. So irrespective of where that is necessarily leading or being, clinging to some specific result that will bring us, happiness and contentment, as if that thing is just out there in the future, something to consistently and incessantly chase. And when we obtain it, of course, there's some new bright, shiny object that appears there. So again, what this often teaches us are the same lessons, which is this ability to be, to cultivate sacred presence or kind of non-judgmental awareness moment to moment is so useful for living a fulfilling and meaningful life.
Yes, life is a happening thing, even though it feels like it's all very cemented and condensed. It's easy to forget the moment by moment as it's passing. I saw this hilarious Onion article title the other day, and it said, "Woman trying to live in the moment, but constantly disrupted by more moments." It gave me a good chuckle.
Yeah.
You pretty much quoted Arjuna and Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, right? Speaking about what in that context was a karmically neutral action for that particular text, but this idea of not being attached to the outcome, but committed to the process, which always gives way to more process.
Yeah, I think that the process can really yield a state of being that is not necessarily something that's presaged. If you are kind of inhabiting the practice of dhyana, meditation, or Zen, and fully immersed within focused concentration, to the point where there is a feeling of integrated consciousness, where the experience of yourself and the world begin to dissipate and disintegrate. There are states of being that arise just simply as a product of that direct experience. And upekkha is definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least in the Buddhist tradition, they talk a lot about karuna, this idea of compassion, where the identification of suffering of others, I suppose it's the identification of the suffering of others as one's own, such that you, by default, bring loving kindness to the presence of suffering wherever it is, in a manner that actively attempts to alleviate that suffering. So the embodiment or the inhabiting of that state of mind is so effusive, but it's hard to talk about it, because to talk about it you need words and symbols, and those always seem to fall short. And that's why Buddhism is so unique as a philosophy, because it is really most experienced as a product of direct experience. I mean, you can certainly intellectually study the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path and the Skandhas and Brahmavihara and Madhyamaka and all these concepts that are central to Buddhism. But at the end of the day, there are no beliefs that need to be espoused per se. It's not dogmatic or fundamentalist, like other religions. It's really meant to be something that is experienced, and then we do our best to come up with concepts like mudita, metta, and karuna, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought your post today, you had just posted about those very things, about karuna and metta. It was well timed. That's a good segue into one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. At the end of your podcast with Elena, you said so much of the time the world shapes the self. To know who we are, we need to look at the ways the world does shape the self, and what are the forces that imprint on our souls and our identity, and how do we unwind those things so the self can better shape the world. And it was said so beautifully and so gracefully. I had just told my students earlier in the week that we have to choose all the time if we are going to be a thermometer reading the temperature of the spaces we're in, or if we're going to be a thermostat. If we're going to get pulled into the tidal wave of divisiveness or of whatever is happening, or if we're going to be carrying an interior state that is projected outwards and pull people into that. And I was just hoping you can speak a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I think in that quote, which of course I don't remember, I think I was referencing, the core tenet of structuralism, which posits that so often we assume that the self shapes the world, but all too often the world shapes the self, and that's true. And we have to face some reality that we don't control that much in life. We don't choose our parents or our genetics. We don't choose the environment or era or political system or religious systems into which we're born. We don't control all of the chains of, causal events that determine our lives. And certainly there's plenty of serendipity and randomness that can influence what it's like to be you. But there does seem to be some free will, a small crack in the door of free will. And that is, at least what I have found, is to be attention, and where we focus our attention moment to moment. And when we really step forward to train our ability to focus our attention in a particular way, that is where we have the most agency. And this, of course, I think part of this is kind of a recognition of the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So this is also a very Stoic concept that influenced a lot of Christian theology and certainly Reinhold Niebuhr. But this idea of really focusing our attention on the things that we can control. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means being very tolerant of others, but very strict with ourselves. And then, being able to cultivate and practice discernment. I know that we emailed a little bit about what does self-mastery look mm-hmm. like? How do we better shape the world, really? You could maybe describe self-mastery somewhat within those parentheses. And part of that, at least day to day, is really the cultivation of good discernment. So this is also a very Stoic idea, but oftentimes our emotional responses to events are determined by our judgment of the events and not the true nature of the events themselves. So we have a particular bias that we're carrying forward, and we see something flash across our feed or whatever, however you might be experiencing that. And because we have a preconceived bias or judgment about that, we have a very emotional response to it. And that emotional response is often negative. So it might be fear, it might be anger, or jealousy or envy. But then we become blinded by the emotion such that we can't actually examine the true nature of the event in the first place. And we live within kind of that pattern of sympathetic overload or amygdala hijack, I often call it, where we are so triggered by our judgments that we lose our ability to discern and our ability for unbiased good judgment. So this is a practice that has been very useful for me, but it's also one that I really encourage for anybody, which is really to try to cultivate the ability to remove judgment or at least be aware of judgment and biases, such that you can really take thoughtful and rigorous looks at phenomena that arise kind of in your life and not be carried away by them and then subsequently fixate or identify with the emotion that can be the cause of a lot of suffering.
That's well said. You talked about that I just listened to your episode on whataboutism, I think you called it, this morning. It was a really potent episode. If you haven't tuned in to Jeff's podcast, One Commune, it's wonderful. And that particular episode was really enlightening. As someone who has a lot of high emotion, I think that's one of the things I've always respected about you and you've modeled so well is how to step back and have a look at facts and to listen to people from a really spacious place. And I think that's one of the real gifts of meditation. I know for me, the longer I've had a meditation practice, every day my listening gets better and my ability to separate the emotional fluctuations from my interior state, from information that's coming in, and to start to tease these things apart, because I think it starts to get like construction paper all glued together and we're no longer identifying, that there's pieces stuck together. And the meditation, at least for me, starts to create that spaciousness to see where, I'm emotionally attached to an idea and have made it my identity. That's usually when I get offended, is when I have attached my identity to my ideas and when I'm being receptive to new information.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's kind of the identification with thoughts and ideas and emotions that really form the ego. And if anything, meditation's goal is the deconstruction of it. And the ego self certainly can take on a lot of forms. I mean, at the simplest level, the ego is the part of you that tells you you are what you do, or what you have, or your position in society, or what role you play. And it often perpetuates your proclivity to judge yourself through the eyes of others and anchor your self-worth through external eyes. So meditation is certainly helpful at deconstructing that. But there's also kind of another dimension of the ego that meditation addresses, which is that meditation can really change the experience of what it is like to be conscious, from thinking or feeling that you are a separate ego self to a feeling or sensation of complete interconnectivity and mutual interdependence and dependent origination. And, I think about how the ego is built, and it is a very natural process that as we kind of emerge from the ocean mind of the womb, where we really see no difference between the experience of what it is like to be you and what it is like to be alive, or your mother, or experience in general. And, as we're spit out into the world and our eyes begin to develop focus and we develop verbal acuity, we spend basically the first 15 years of our life labeling everything that emerges within our awareness, from very simple things like a plant or a mountain or a tree, that we see everything as defined by its outline. And then, of course, as we kind of mature, we begin to sort of refine that differentiation, as around political affiliation or religious affiliation or skin color or what have you. And inherent to this process of labeling everything is labeling yourself. And we feel this drive for individuation, of essentially creating a separate identity for ourselves from the rest of the world. And like I said, that's a very natural, process, given the instruments that we have to perceive the world, mostly our eyes, because we're so visual. And this constant process of labeling creates a label that we give ourselves, and that is the ego. And because we are so, that sight plays such a prominent part in the process of labeling, we begin to assume that there is a self crouching behind our eyes somewhere, like a tiger. And that, but the life sciences have yet to find that self. And this, of course, is the hard problem of consciousness. But that, we begin to really become psychologically married to this idea that I am a separate being and there is a self somewhere right behind my eyes. Yeah. And of course, this then begets a lifetime of comparison of I am separate than that. Well, how is that doing? Well, and of course, this is what, the Buddha was sort of poking at when he was talking about Trishna or thirst or craving, is that when you are in a state of comparison, because you think of yourself as a separate ego self, you're always looking and comparing that label that you have for yourself with other people and other things. And so you begin to develop ideas that, well, if only and only if I can, get that thing or that house or that boyfriend or that new car, well, then I'll be happy. Mm. And we start these cycles of craving, which put us on this hedonic treadmill of in the pursuit of quote unquote out there happiness, as if external agents can ever address that. And of course, I mean, nirvana has plenty of components to it, but one of which is the letting go or the blowing out of desire, of craving, but that's very connected to the delusion of the ego self. And so I think part of a spiritual journey is dismantling this notion of the ego self. And, I don't want to claim or posit that there's no self at all. We do have a body that has its own DNA, and we all experience subjectivity. We all have stories that I might classify as the contents of consciousness. But it is our over-identification with that part of ourselves and not consciousness itself that is the provenance of a tremendous amount of suffering. And I think this is why a meditation practice or any spiritual practice is really helpful or beneficial because it helps dismantle this feeling of separateness.
Yeah, that's all really well said. And I feel that this is all escalated in the age that we live in now, the individualism, the comparison, the self-possession and self-obsession, with fame and social media, which is a blessing and a curse.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I've been checking in with my own feelings around this word sovereign and sovereignty, which
that is the word that I pulled this morning from Elena's ceremony deck for my day, was the word sovereignty. So that's so funny.
Yeah, obviously it's getting used a lot right now in a whole variety of different ways, obviously in association with body sovereignty, in this very confusing political environment as it pertains to vaccines on one side, but also abortion on the other side. And it's funny because it's a word that has its etymology in monarchy and kings, and so it's and it always brings up for me this question of like, well, did I make my own oxygen? Did I really make my own glucose? Well, my liver kind of does when I run out of it, but no, did I make all of the 39 trillion bacteria cells that are in my gut and in my nose and in my mouth? It's like, am I in complete control of all of the different hormones that are arising and subsiding in different moments inside my body? So, we're not particularly sovereign moment to moment of our body. And again, it also kind of points to this, something about the ego, that we sort of live with this delusion that there is a stable self, sort of a stable, reliable self. And again, that's a very natural product of experience, because there is a lot of seeming continuity to psychology and physiology. Like, you wake up and you look at your body and it looks more or less the same as it did yesterday. And you do a mental scan and you more or less believe all the same things that you believed yesterday. And one moment is so much like the moment before it that you just assume that there is a stable and reliable self.
Yeah.
But if you were to look at the reality of that, it is just a complete illusion.
It's a total illusion. That's why our memories, you can return to an amusement park you went to as a child and everything looks completely different because you are not the self that you were when you saw it as a child or 10 years ago. It's one of the examples I always think of is the way memory operates. It's that alone shows us that there's not a stable self.
Absolutely. I mean, it's often most, obviously depicted in photos. You can look at a photo of yourself as a strapping 20-year-old, tennis player, which I sometimes do. And of course, I don't recognize myself at all because I'm 51. I'm like, where's that body? But moment to moment, I feel, as if I am stable. Again, I think this is one of the great lessons that one can learn about impermanence. If there's anything that doesn't change, it's change. And that moment to moment, we are in a constant state of flux, both physiologically and psychologically. And even the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves are often in flux. And, the contents of consciousness, like these stories that we use to prop up a certain identity that we have in a particular moment for ourselves. When I look at my own stories, and, I won't impute this on anyone else, but my own stories are often just complete bullshit. It's like they're serving me in the moment, of what is the, what is the portrait of me right now, and how do these stories, serve that? And I don't mean to in any way undermine, trauma that anybody has undergone. There is real trauma. There are real stories that can leave, real impressions and some scars, trapped energy patterns in people, and also just in your brain create, synaptic connections that are hard to unwind because they're so marked by, spikes of epinephrine and all this stuff that seems to codify memory. But so many of these stories, every experience of the past, which is, I suppose, a story, is only experienced again in the present.
Yeah.
So memory, in a way, can be seen as just a recapitulation of past stories in the present.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to deceive ourselves as we do that.
Memory is a reflection, right? It's the way in which we reflect on what happened, and that shifts the memory, which is why, when you get where you want to go and you look back on your life, things that were painful, you look at them with the view of, well, thank God that happened because it led me to this moment. Yeah. But that's because the reflection has changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
The event didn't change. Your reflection of it has shifted.
Yeah, the valence that you assign it, basically.
Yes.
That's a great example. We tend to say that, that difficult time turned out to be my best teacher.
Yeah.
Well, in the moment it was happening, it wasn't.
Yeah.
I see that we might have
Yeah, it says lost connection to reconnected.
Reconnected.
Okay. Hopefully it didn't pause anything. I've been nervous. I can edit this part out. I've been nervous because I can't see any wave of my own vocals, just yours, but I'm just assuming everything is recording correctly.
It is. I see your wave.
Oh, good.
And,
okay.
You are waving as part of the greater ocean.
Oh, wonderful. Woo. Okay. Well, I won't keep you too much longer.
No, it's all good.
I'm so enjoying talking to you. I'll put a little pause there so I can edit that section out. Lost my train of thought now,
That's
Jeff.
Okay. I'll pull something. I'll pull on a thread there. Please. Related to that last bit of our discussion, which is the way that we assign positivity or negativity to a particular feeling in the moment is often just incredibly arbitrary and also impermanent. So I'll start with just this idea, which is, oftentimes when you're facing something that is a fear or a phobia, for me, that's often public speaking. Even though I think I'm decent at it, I still have a tremendous amount of anxiety in the build up to it. Mm. And everybody has that in their life, unless they're Superwoman or Superman. And if you really kind of examine the sensation itself, this butterflies in your stomach, or like this watermelon or grapefruit that lodges in your throat, or your respiratory rate increases and your heart rate increases and you get kind of prickly sweats or whatever. If you really examine the sensation of anxiety, you will notice how similar that sensation is to excitement. It's almost the same thing, but we've just assigned a particular negative valence to anxiety. And so this is our mind at work, tricking us. And, and it also points to how mercurial emotions and feelings and sensations are, because the moment I step on stage, I'm still feeling all those things. But once I start speaking, it's just absolutely effusive excitement. All of the anxiety goes away. Yeah. And you see this kind of phenomenon happen all the time. I mean, let's say like you sprain your ankle in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you're home and it's pulsating and aching and you're fixated on it and it's a drag and you're not going to be able to do yoga tomorrow and it's painful, and all of a sudden, and then in a moment like, Elena calls you and she's like, we're going to Costa Rica and you're going to be, you're going to co-teach this retreat with me. And all of a sudden, you're not thinking about your ankle at all. It's just that pain and dread associated with your ankle has transmuted in just to excitement and joy. And so that we can, when we're really kind of excavate the nature of how the mind works in relationship to emotions, it is very revealing. And I suppose if we become good at controlling the mind, we don't really have to control anything else.
I agree. There's actually a personal development exercise that comes from a therapy technique that Holly Love, who is one of my partners, she's a therapist or a counselor, pardon me, uses, called Choose a Situation. And when you have a difficult situation, you sit and purge and journal about it and all the feelings and all your narrative and your story. And after you read the exercise out loud over and over and over again, your story, your narrative, to a friend or to yourself, you go through and cross out everything in the story that's in an interpretation. Mm. There's usually like 3 sentences left.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's phenomenal. I do it a lot because anytime I have a lot of intensity around something, because it lets me scale back and be less emotional about whatever the situation is, like you said, to take some of the judgment off and to have a look at what's actually there. And I can be more responsive when I'm not operating out of the narrative and the story I've placed around whatever occurrence I'm writing about.
Nice. Yeah. That's a great practice and very practical.
Yeah.
I can imagine what the piece of paper looks like at the end of that exercise. It's like, I am.
Exactly. I am. Okay. Shoot.
Yeah. Cross out, X.
Yeah.
No, that's a good practice. I do have a little course that I recorded on stoicism. I got into stoicism through my friend Jules Evans, and it's also quite a practical philosophy, sort of a philosophy of ethics that posits that the good life, or what the Greeks called eudaimonia, is a product of living a life with virtue. Mm-hmm. And it's very focused on 4 core virtues, which is moderation, courage, justice, and wisdom. And it has its own sort of meditation tradition. The most famous book of Stoicism was a book by Marcus Aurelius, who became the Emperor of Rome, called Meditations. But they're not exactly meditations as we understand them in the Buddhist tradition. They're not vipassana meditations where, you're just returning your attention to the sensation of your breath. They're really more contemplations to bring forth sort of a greater understanding of the nature of virtue, or of the nature of what it's like to be alive. So one of those, and they're often seemingly on their face somewhat morbid and morose. Mm-hmm. So actually Buddhism has Maranasati, which is like meditations on one's own mortality.
Yes.
Which is like memento mori in Stoicism. But there's this one particular practice that I have been employing lately, and it's best titled "Loving What You Have." Mm. And I'll just take a moment to describe it, because I feel like it's incredibly practical and useful. So, as we were kind of talking earlier about the nature of the ego and how the ego identifies external things in one's life that will make them happy. So whether or not that's a new job, some sort of new exalted role in society, or a thing, etc., or an honor. And then, of course, someone toils away to achieve that thing. And then once they obtain it, well, it's lovely for a moment. But, as soon as you've cut the ribbon off the box, basically there's a new shiny object that appears on the horizon, and there's another thing to chase. Yeah. And this is what I often refer to as the hedonic treadmill, is that we're never really quite obtain happiness. It's always something out there that we're chasing. Yeah. So this practice focuses on identifying something in your life that you really, truly cherish. So just you can spend some time really meditating on that. What is something in my life that I really, truly cherish? It might be a relationship, that you have with a friend or a loved one. That might be a particular specific object that is, unique and has some sort of direct relatability. Maybe it's like some sweater that your grandmother made for you, whatever. And then you meditate on losing that thing, that object, or that relationship. And you really sit in the sensation of that thing no longer being there in your life. And that's somewhat the morbid part, at least on face value. But in the end, it's hardly morose at all, because what this elicits is a tremendous feeling or sensation of gratitude for the thing that you have.
Yes.
And this can be one of the great practical techniques for happiness day to day, is just loving what you already have.
That's really beautiful, and arguably would also help with the clinging.
Yes.
I was on retreat with Elena in Costa Rica in December, and she was teaching on the 4 tenets of the Zen Peace Walker. And the first tenet was the not knowing, resting in the not knowing. And she had suggested meditating on the death of someone you love, that it was a Zen Buddhist practice, and really going through those difficult emotions, because when the thing then does go, because everything changes and everything that rises ceases, as the Buddha said, when it goes, you've practiced it. And so you know how to be spacious around the let go and the release of what is inevitably going to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also the Stoic practice of memento mori, which is directing that same kind of attention towards your own mortality.
Yeah.
And knowing that it is unpredictable. It can come at any time. You're not going to take any of your worldly possessions with you. So again, how are you going to spend your attention moment to moment when you're sitting within that space of knowing that this is unpredictable and I can't know and I'm not going to take anything with me? So how am I going to show up right now?
Yeah. I think that's the big difference between, I've been thinking a lot this past week about the difference between routine and ritual. And when things are routinized, they become mundane and gray. And that's when life starts to pass us by. But when what is routine is made ritualized and holy with our attention, to quote Martin Shaw, the holy with attention part, that's when stuff stays really vibrant, and we're in this place of gratitude for what's in front of us, because we're approaching things with a reverence moment by moment, instead of, I have to go do this thing today that I have to do every day. How do we ritualize things to take them out of the, mundane and routine?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also just asterisk anything that I might say on this podcast or anywhere else is a recapitulation of something that someone else said.
Of course.
And I heard this story, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but that when Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning, I think the original edition of it was anonymous.
Interesting.
That he did not want to put his name to it. And eventually he was convinced to do that for a whole host of, I think, good reasons. But even if you go back into the Pali Canon, that of course, for generations upon generations was largely oral.
Yes.
But that no one would claim authorship to any sort of subsequent idea of the Buddhas. That was always just the Buddha.
And the Hindus do this very well too. They mythologize the authorship of things. People often think certain, for example, the author of different texts, the word often means editor, not an actual person. But then there's also a myth about this editor, to ascribe this grandiose and ancestral, authorship and to texts. And I think it's really beautiful